Yeah, we back. Now, today's video gonna be a follow-up video to one I dropped the other day entitled Letters Written by Dessalines. Now, in this series, because I think I'm gonna make it a multi-part series, I'm gonna be resurrecting old historical documents, letters that were written by Dessalines. I'm gonna be reacting to it, right? Breaking it down. So in today's video, I'm gonna be reacting to a letter that Dessalines wrote to the authorities on the Spanish part of the island. I believe the letter was written in October 1804, and this letter was basically a warning, right? Basically, a heads up to the inhabitants of the Spanish part of the island, basically letting them know that Dessalines' army is about to march into the territory. So you have two options. You can choose to fly under the banner of liberty, or you can take the side of our adversaries and you'll be treated as such. Now, many historians classify this as an invasion by the Haitian army into the Spanish territory. And today, that's what we're going to be talking about. But before we jump into that, we have to go all the way back to the beginning to understand and lay the foundation to how we got to that point. To better understand everything, we got to go back to 1791 when the rebellion had first broke out. Who were the two ruling colonial powers on that island? On one side, it was Spain. On the other side, it was France. And these were two colonial powers that were in competition. During that time, there was no NATO, there was no United Nations, there was no Security Council. It wasn't any of that. There wasn't any of these international organizations for the advancement of Western geopolitical interests. It was every man for himself, every colonial power for himself. So the Spanish were in competition with the French were in competition with the British, the Americans were in competition with the Europeans. Everybody was every man for himself during that time. There was no unity at all. It was straight tribalism. Now, the benefit of that, because the Europeans were not united during that time at all, it was easy to play the different colonial powers against each other, right? It was easy to play Spain against France. It was easy to play, the British against the French. It was easy to play the Americans against the French, right? So that's what our forefathers did. They were playing the different colonial powers against each other, right? So in the early 1790s, in the beginning of the rebellion, a lot of black men crossed over the border into the Spanish side because the Spanish were offering to give them arms and ammunition and resources to wage a war against the French colonial powers. And why were they doing that? Because they wanted to destabilize the French. And if the French were destabilized, that would make it easy for them to come in and take over that territory. Because the Spanish wanted to take over the other side of the island, because the French side of the island was one of the most prosperous and powerful colonies in all of the Western Hemisphere. So if that territory came under their control, they'll be able to reap the economic benefits of the other side of the island. So the Spanish during that time wanted to destabilize the French. And how did they do that? By arming certain rebels like Toussaint, by arming certain rebels like George Biassou. Now, eventually, when Toussaint discovered that the Spanish were actually using him to expand their slave-holding operations, he defected away from the Spanish side. He left the Spanish side. But you had guys like George Biassou, who was actually promoted to a Spanish general. He was a general in the army of Spain. And in the mid-1790s, he left the colony and went to Spanish Florida and became a big landowner in Florida, was the second highest paid official in Florida, and his house down in Florida is like a national monument down in St. Augustine, Florida. Now, fast forward to the year 1800, 1801. Toussaint crossed over the border into the eastern side of the island, into the Spanish side of the island, to establish his control over that territory. Why? To capture the port of Santo Domingo. And the reason why he wanted to capture the port of Santo Domingo is because he wanted to establish full control over the entire island. He did not want to have any weak spots, because if you do not have full control over all the ports of the island, then what would stop an invading European force from landing in a port that is not under your control, right? So he wanted to establish full dominion over the entire territory. So he crossed over the border and captured the port of Santo Domingo, pretty much without firing a shot, essentially. Now, of course, as we know, the French invaded in 1802. We already know what happened with that. The French were defeated. We already know what happened. But when the French were defeated, not all of them decided to go back to their country, right? There was a number of French soldiers, French troops that instead of going, hopping on them ships and going back to France, a number of them went over the border and set up shop on the Spanish side of the island, right? In the border regions especially, right? So instead of going home, there was a small garrison that went over to, modern day Dominican territory and continued the hostilities from the war. Now, a while ago, about a year ago, I dropped a video where I basically spoke about the so-called Haitian invasion in 1805. And I'm going to play a small clip from that. Basically, it talks about the French general who had set up shop on the Spanish side of the island and was still waging war against the Haitians. His name was General Jean-Louis Ferrand, a French general who, instead of going back to his country, he decided to wage war against the Haitians by a variety of different methods, but mainly his main objective was capturing Haitians, kidnapping them, and selling them into slavery. Now, I'm going to play a clip from that video. I'll be right back. A returned French commander-in-chief, General Ferrand, now declared publicly his intentions in a decree issued on the 6th of January 1805 from his headquarters in Santo Domingo. Article 1 of that decree authorized the residents of the departments of Ozama and the Cibao to begin expeditions to apprehend and imprison insurgents of the occupied frontier regions, with that designation referring for all intents and purposes to the blacks and mulattoes of the borderlands. Articles 2 and 3 guaranteed that such prisoners will belong as property to their captors. Article 4 expressly stipulated that black and mulatto children 10 years of age or younger were to be kept inside the colony and not exported. But Article 5 allowed that boys of 10 to 14 years of age and females of 12 to 14 years to be sold, but only through the port of Santo Domingo as required by Article 6. Article 13 offered a suspension of hostilities against all those insurgents who recognized their error and submitted to the authority of the French emperor. Now, as you can see, the French general Jean-Louis Ferrand, he crossed over the border, set up shop on the Spanish side of the island, and he issued an official decree stating to apprehend and imprison the so-called insurgents of the occupied frontier regions. And what he means by that is basically arrest and kidnap basically any Haitian citizen, man, woman, and child, because they were all deemed as rebel insurgents on occupied territory. So basically, that's what he was doing, right? He set up shop along the border and began kidnapping Haitian citizens to sell them into slavery. And that is what provoked Dessalines' hostilities and what provoked Dessalines to march into the Spanish territory. Now, a while back, if you listen to me read that book, I read a book entitled Black Crown by Paul Clammer. And go to my playlist section. I have a playlist entitled The Biography of King Henry Christophe, where I read that entire book, start to finish. And in that book, they actually talk about, because Christophe was actually one of the generals that organized the so-called invasion, right? Because he was one of the generals that actually led the march into the territory at the head of the army. And in that book, they actually talk about that time period, right? So I'm going to play a clip from that and I'll be right back. Its commander at Santo Domingo, General Jean-Louis Ferrand, a French general, remained determined to take war to the Haitians in whatever way he could. He outfitted privateers to carry out raids along the coast, and on capturing one Haitian vessel, had its entire crew murdered. In early 1805, he announced plans to capture any rebels found along the border and sell them into slavery. For French General Ferrand, only repentant submission to Bonaparte could bring an end to the hostility. Now, before I get into Dessalines' letter, I just want to, lay the groundwork first, because we got to understand that, yes, even though the two populations share one island, there was a difference in demographics, even during the colonial period on both sides of the island. Now, in Dessalines' letter, he basically gives the authorities on the Spanish side of the island an ultimatum, basically saying that you have two options. You can fly under the banner of liberty, or you can align yourself with our enemies and you'll face the consequences. Now, in the Spanish side of the island, similar to the French side of the island, there was a strict racial hierarchy. At the top, of course, you had the Spaniards, and then you had the descendants of the Spaniards, right? The children, the offspring of the Spaniards. They were the ones that controlled most of the land. They were the ones that controlled the politics and the economics, and they had a strong loyalty to Spain. And not only Spain, but the colonial system in general. They had a strong loyalty to white supremacy. Then below them, you had the mixed race population. You had the mulattoes and the octoroons and the hexadecaroons and everything in between, because as we already know, the Spanish colonists, just like all the other European colonists, was a degenerate. So because of that, because of his sexual degeneracy, a large mixed race population was created, just like in all the other Spanish colonies. Now, this class of people had more social mobility, but in order to, achieve social mobility, they had to distance themselves away from blackness in order to move up in the racial hierarchy. Now, these two classes, right, the Spaniards, the descendants of the Spaniards, and the mixed race population, they made up a large proportion of the population on the Spanish side of the island. And still to this day, it's the same thing. And besides those classes of people, then you had the, the maroon communities, the runaway slaves, in the mountains living autonomously. And of course, it would be from this population of people that would find the most sympathy with the Haitian revolutionaries, right? The runaway slaves living off in the mountains, right? Or those who might have still been on the plantation. Those who had to live under the prejudice and discrimination of the colonial system. So a lot of people from this class actually joined forces with the Haitians, right? And then you had individuals who actually rose to high status, like Jose Campos Tavares, who actually became a high-ranking official in Christophe's regime. And then, of course, you had another individual, I forget his name, but he also was the chief, designer of Christophe's palace. It was somebody, a Spanish-speaking brother from the other side of the island. I forget his name. So, there were a lot that actually joined forces with the Haitians. And then obviously there were some that joined forces with the French, the Europeans. And that is why the French military was able to cross over the border and set up shop without anybody firing a shot. Because even though the French and the Spanish, France and Spain were two different empires, and sometimes they were rivals, the white elites in Santo Domingo, they did not see the French coming over the border as their enemy. They saw them as fellow Europeans. And when they seen guys like Dessalines and Christophe rise into power, they saw that as a threat to European interests as a collective, right? They saw that as perhaps the end of slavery, the end of white domination, right? The rise of black sovereignty. They saw that as a threat. So that's why they embraced the French when they crossed over the border. And that's why Dessalines had to launch the invasion in 1805 and chase the French over the border. Now, anyway, let's jump into the letter, right? October 1804, right? Dessalines sent them the warning. Some of them didn't listen. Anyway, let's get into it. At the top, liberty or death. Proclamation of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the Governor General. To the inhabitants of the Spanish side, Dessalines said this: as soon as the French army was gone, you quickly recognized my authority. By a free and spontaneous movement of your hearts, you range yourselves under my subjection, more careful of the prosperity than the ruin of that part which you inhabit. I give to this homage a favorable reception. From that moment, I considered you as my children, and my fidelity to you remains undiminished. To show my protective leadership in the areas under my control, I have chosen leaders from among yourselves. Enthusiastic to have you as my friends, I have given you all the time you needed to think things over and to prove your loyalty. The French General Ferrand had not yet filled you with lies and slander. Writings originated in despair and weakness have been circulated, and immediately many amongst you, seduced by perfidious insinuations, solicited the friendship and protection of the French. Now, time out. Now, Dessalines, now listen, big bro, you got to understand. During that time, the Spanish side of the island was still controlled by the white Spaniard European elites. So obviously, yes, they would have more camaraderie, more commonality with the white Frenchmen than they do with the black men. That's just normal. So that's to be expected. Of course, the white elites over there connected with the French military when they crossed over the border, obviously on the basis of the commonality of race and class. Now let's continue. They dared to insult my kindness by collaborating with my cruel enemies. Spaniards, think carefully. On the edge of the disaster that awaits you, will that evil French minister save you when I chase you with fire and sword to the last stronghold? To win over the Spaniards, the French have spread rumors that ships full of troops have arrived at Santo Domingo. To create fear and distrust, they constantly remind people of what just happened to the French. But did I not have good reason to treat them that way? The crimes committed by the French, do they relate to the Spaniards? And should I punish the Spaniards for the crimes that the French had planned, ordered, and carried out against my people? Now, time out. Now, in that part of the letter, Dessalines is basically reflecting upon the manipulation and the false narratives and the fear mongering that is being carried out by the French, right? The French trying to, bring the Spaniards, the inhabitants of the Spanish side over to their side, right? Spreading rumors, trying to persuade them to join their cause. And basically what Dessalines is saying is that the Spaniards have no reason to feel any animosity towards him because whatever happened between the Haitians and the French, that's Haitian business. That don't got nothing to do with you. Now, of course, when I say Spaniards, I'm talking about the inhabitants of the modern day Dominican territory. But during this time in 1805, the Dominican Republic did not exist, right? So Dessalines referred to the inhabitants of the Spanish side as the Españols. So when I say Spaniards, I'm really talking about Dominicans. But at this time, Dominicans did not exist. Now, let's continue. In a short time, I will crush the remaining French under the weight of my great power. Spaniards, I'm speaking to you because I want to save you. Those of you who have tried to escape will soon only live as long as I choose to show you mercy. There is still time to correct your mistakes, which could be deadly for you. Cut ties with my enemy if you don't want your fate to be tied with theirs. Think about your survival. Here, I give you my solemn promise that I will not harm your personal safety or interests as long as you take this chance to prove yourselves worthy of being considered part of Haiti. Now, that's what Dessalines said. That's the message that Dessalines sent to, the Dominicans back in October 1804. And I believe the invasion would be launched a few months later in early 1805. Now, take a look up on the screen. After crossing into Santo Domingo, a contingent of forces, 2,000 strong, led by Christophe, had their march to the capital opposed by the frontier forces of Santiago, despite their numbering only 200 men. The ensuing battle resulted in the total destruction of the smaller force. The men were taken prisoner, being beheaded, and the town itself being sacked. Those that fled to Mocha were initially granted clemency on the condition that they no longer opposed the movement of Dessalines' army. Once the various forces met up on the outskirts of the capital, they found the city of 6,000 had been fortified in anticipation of the attack, with all of the 2,000 French soldiers on the island on their defense. They put the town to siege for 3 weeks, but upon seeing a local French fleet upon the horizon sail in the direction of Haiti, Dessalines broke off the assault and rushed to the defense of the country in anticipation of a new French invasion. Dessalines instead opted to raze various towns to deprive the French of military useful material. Now, if you take a look up on the screen, you'll see a map that actually details the routes that were taken by the armies of Dessalines and Christophe, right? You see Dessalines, he marched from Port-au-Prince at the bottom and crossed over the border, right? And Christophe, he marched from his headquarters in the north all the way at the top in the Cap, and then he crossed over the border, and as you can see, the destination all the way to the port of Santo Domingo. Now, on the way back, as you can see, you see all the marks of fire. Those are all the towns that Dessalines and Christophe, mainly Christophe, had burned down on their retreat back to their side of the island. As you can see, Christophe on his way back hit the town of Monte Plata, burned it. Cotuí, burned it. San Francisco, burnt it. La Vega, burned it. Mocha, burned it. Santiago, burned it. San Jose de las Matas, burned it. Montecristi, burned it. Dessalines on his way back, San Juan, burned it. And the reason why they did that is because it was that same scorched earth policy they employed during the revolution, right? They thought that the French were going to invade the island, so they wanted to deprive them of any useful resources to wage a war against the Haitians. So, like I said, scorched earth policy, burned it. Now, this event historically has been a source of tension between Haitians and Dominicans, which I understand, which obviously if you're a descendant of the white Spaniards, you know, the mixed race elites on the island, of course, you would see this as an act of aggression. But at the same time, we have to tell the full story, right? When Dessalines issued his proclamation in late 1804, he told them, listen, if you harbor our enemies, if you give refuge to the same people who enslaved and slaughtered us, then you have chosen a side, and you will be treated as if you are on that side. And that's what happened. And that's what many of the elites on the Spanish side of the island, that's what they did. They allowed the French military to come over the border, acquire land, right? Take land. They allowed them to intermarry with the local women, right? The local Spaniard women, the local, indigenous women, the local African women, embed themselves into Dominican society. That's what happened. That's what many of them allowed to happen. And unfortunately, by doing that, they attracted the aggression of Dessalines. And unfortunately, that's what happens when you allow mass murderers to set up shop inside your house. That's why Dessalines had to go over the border and do what he had to do. Now, of course, there were some Dominicans that chose to fly under the banner of liberty, like I mentioned before. Individuals like Jose Campos Tavares, he aligned himself with the Haitian military, and he actually ended up becoming a high-ranking official under the regime of Christophe. But there were many others who doubled down, and when Dessalines came, they reaped the consequences of their decisions. Now, unfortunately, in the Dominican history books, in the textbooks, in the curriculum, this entire context is not acknowledged, right? Dessalines is just painted as a barbarian, and there's no mention of the French troops that were hiding out on the Spanish side of the island, that were still launching raids and engaging in human trafficking and selling Haitians into slavery. All of that context is not acknowledged, right? They don't make any mention of the fact that Dessalines gave them an option, right? And many of them chose white supremacy. And that's just what it is, right? That's just what it is. But in the curriculum, in the narrative, in the Dominican textbooks, it paints the Haitians as the aggressors and the Dominicans as, the innocent victims, when in reality, there were many Dominican elites who were actually collaborators with the French. And that's just a fact. That's undeniable fact. So much so that many of the Dominican founding fathers are actually the descendants of Frenchmen. Take a look up on the screen. Several prominent Dominican generals and figures with notable French ancestry include First Fondeur La Jeunesse, a military man and politician who fought in the Dominican War of Independence and the Dominican Restoration War. Also, Major General Jose Maria Imbert, a French migrant who achieved victories against Haiti, and his descendants, including Brigadier General Segundo Francisco Imbert and Antonio Imbert Barrera, who also held prominent positions in the Dominican Republic. So, like I said, after the Haitians had driven the French off the island, many Frenchmen crossed over the border and established themselves on the Spanish side of the island, right? Intermarried with the locals, had children, and embedded themselves in Dominican society, with many of their descendants actually fighting in the Dominican War of Independence against the Haitians in the 1840s. But anyways, man, when we talk about the 1805 so-called Haitian invasion, right, we have to talk about it in its full context, right? We can't just frame it as a random act of aggression against Dominicans. No, that was a continuation of the war that had been raging since 1791, a war between the Haitian people and the French colonial empire, right? When the French forces crossed over the border into the Spanish side of the island, they did not automatically become innocent civilians. No, they were still the same mass murderers that slaughtered our people for centuries, right? They were the same men who committed unspeakable crimes against our people. They were still hostile, they were still dangerous, and they were still launching raids and military operations from the border in 1805, right? They were still operating with the support and protection of certain Dominican elites who chose to stand side by side with them on the basis and commonality of race and class. So what did Dessalines do? He chased them into the Spanish side of the territory, because no sovereign nation is going to allow a hostile enemy to cross the border, to intermarry with the local women and start families and acquire land and begin kidnapping children at the border to sell them into slavery. Nobody's going to allow that to happen just a few miles away from the border. No. So unfortunately, they attracted the aggression of the Haitian military at the time. And in early 1805, they crossed over the border and invaded the territory. That's just what it is. And listen, if you're a Dominican nationalist, if you feel, some resentment towards Haitians, don't bring that to my comment section. If you're a Dominican neo-Nazi, just keep that to yourself, bro, because I'm going to disband you from the channel, man. If you get emotional by us talking about the historical facts and the reality, listen, man, I'm going to disband you from the channel, man. Keep that nonsense to yourself. Them European, Hispanic, Dominicans, man, keep that BS to yourself, man. I know many of y'all are the direct descendants of your European forefathers, but like I said, man, keep that European white supremacist, fake narrative to yourself, man, because I'm not tolerating it. Anyway, it's your boy Nebuchadnezzar Dessalines back in the Billy. Yes, indeed. Cash App in the description. Support the channel. Album out now. Available everywhere. Sahel 1816. And I'm gone. Peace.
Gotta go get it, I'm never waiting. Stay the trends and I'm innovative. Shorty, she on me, she said she love me. Straight to the top and I'm elevated. Straight to the top and I'm never stopping. Running my business, I'm enterprising. Where's that money, I get it fast. Stay in my lane and I hit the gas. Counting my blessings and make it last. Don't want a fraction, I want it all. Stick to the code and the protocol. Feel like a king and I'll never fall. Fuck up a check when I'm in the mall. Riding that German, I'm in a Benz. Plotting revenge, I don't make amends. Hitting that corner and make a bend. Up in the sky like commercial pilots. Keep it 100, I'm moving silence. Know we united, they can't divide us. Say that she love when I give her guidance. Told me she love me, I know it's real. Know they gon' hate, but I know the deal. Know they gon' hate when you so official. Paying my dues like I'm sacrificial. Handle my business so beneficial. Ride on my enemies with the miss. Ride on my enemies with a chop. Coming for blood, make them call the doctor. Coming for blood, I ain't showing mercy. Probably gon' kill me or try to hurt me. Probably gon' kill me, I keep it tinted. Bulletproof vehicle when I whip it. Came from the bottom, I really live it. Really, my life is a motion picture. Lately, I feel like the trend is topping. Keep it authentic, I keep it honest. Up at the bank with a new deposit. Call me the boss and I pay the cost. Feel like a rocket, I'm taking off. Come to the crib and she take it off. Gotta go get it, I'm never waiting. Stay in the trends and I'm innovative. Shorty, she on me, she said she love me. Straight to the top and I'm elevated. Straight to the top and I'm never stopping. Running my business, I'm enterprising. Where's that money, I get it fast. Stay in my lane and I hit the gas. Counting my blessings and make it last. Don't want a fraction, I want it all. Stick to the code and the protocol. Feel like a king and I'll never fall. Fuck up a check when I'm in the mall. Riding that German, I'm in a Benz. Plotting revenge, I don't make amends. Hitting that corner and make it bend. Go. Never wait. Innovative. Say she love me. Elevated. Never stopping. Enterprising. Get it fast.